Madame Rosalind had never met a mark she couldn't read. 211 of them over 6 years in a shoebox town called Fenimore. She read their grief. She read their bank accounts. She read the exact moment they'd hand over their life savings for one more word from beyond the grave. Client 212 sat down, smiled, and read her right back. But let's back up, because to understand how badly this went for her, you need to understand how good she actually was. Her real name was Dot Kessler. Nobody in Fenimore knew that. To them, she was Madame Rosalind, third-generation clairvoyant, keeper of the sacred circle on Maple Street, purple curtains, dim lamps, a cat she'd bought specifically because cats look mystical sitting in windows. None of it was real. All of it worked. Here's the trick, and it's not magic. It's homework. Before every session, her assistant Early Vance spent 2 or 3 days digging. Obituaries, church bulletins, Facebook profiles set to public because nobody in this town understood privacy settings. Early would find out who died, who owed money, who was getting divorced, whose kid was in trouble. Then Rosalind would sit across from a grieving widow and say something like, "I'm sensing a man, older. He passed with something wrong in his chest." And the widow would gasp, because of course he did. Everybody's husband dies of something in the chest eventually, but it never felt like a guess. It felt like a miracle. That's the con, not tricks. Preparation dressed up as destiny. And it paid. Rosalind charged $300 for a basic reading and could push a desperate client past $10,000 for what she called a spirit debt release, a ritual invented entirely that supposedly cleared money owed to the dead so their souls could rest. It only worked on people who were already breaking. Grief does that. It makes you willing to pay any price for one more sentence from someone you lost. A year before our story really starts, one of those clients was a woman named Vivian Hargrove. Keep her name. It matters later. Vivian drained her retirement account chasing one more message from her late husband. And within 8 months of meeting Rosalind, Vivian was gone too. The official story was her heart. Nobody in town connected it to the fortune teller. Rosalind made sure of that. She always did. So by the time our actual client walks through the purple curtain, Rosalind is not some nervous rookie. She's a machine, confident, careful, bulletproof, or so she thinks. He introduced himself as Walter Combs, 50-something, soft-spoken, wedding ring still on even though he said his wife had passed 8 months earlier. He told Early at the front desk that money wasn't a concern. He just wanted to talk to Eleanor one more time. Early, who fed every detail straight to Rosalind before each session, practically danced back into the reading room. A grieving, wealthy widower with no living family to ask inconvenient questions? That's not a client. That's a jackpot. Rosalind read him beautifully. First session, she landed 3 cold reads in a row. A woman's name close to Eleanor, a health complaint near the stomach, a disagreement about a house that never got resolved. Walter's eyes welled up right on cue. He paid in a certified check for $2,200 and asked, voice cracking just enough, if he could come back next week. Question for you. If you were running this scam and a grieving rich widower with no family just handed you a blank check and asked to come back, would you slow down or would you speed up? Rosalind sped up. Of course she did. Over the next 5 weeks, Walter Combs became her best client in company history. Every session bigger than the last. A clearing ritual here. An ancestral debt there. A special candle blessed under a full moon that cost $400 to manufacture and $800 to sell. By week 6, Walter had handed over just under $85,000, and Rosalind had started mentally shopping for a bigger house outside of town. But small cracks were already showing, if you knew where to look. And Rosalind, brilliant as she was at reading strangers, was too busy counting money to look. Crack 1. Walter never paid with the same bank twice. Certified checks, cashier's checks, sometimes a money order. Always a different institution, sometimes from towns 2 hours away. A careful person launders attention like that. A genuinely grieving widower does not think about it at all. Crack 2. Early mentioned, almost as a joke, that Walter had asked him, casually in the waiting room like small talk, whether Rosalind had ever done a reading for an older woman, maybe named Vivian. Early laughed it off and said he couldn't remember every client. Rosalind laughed too at the time. She stopped laughing about it later. Crack 3, and this is the one she actually saw and still ignored. Walter carried a small black notebook everywhere. He'd jot things down mid-session, supposedly notes on what Eleanor was communicating, dates and names, the kind of thing a griever might do to hold on to every word. Rosalind noticed once that his handwriting looked less like a man taking comfort and more like a man taking inventory. She told herself grief does strange things to people. She was half right. Here's the midpoint, and it's the moment everything tips. Walter left his notebook behind after a session, accidentally, he said later, though nothing about that man was ever an accident. Rosalind opened it expecting grief scrawl. Instead, she found dates, amounts. Every payment she'd taken from him, itemized, matched against bank names and check numbers. And on the very first page, underlined twice, a name that wasn't Walter Combs at all. Nathaniel Hargrove. Vivian's son. Take a second with that, because it recontextualizes everything you just heard. Every session, every tear, every Eleanor. None of it was grief. It was evidence collection, performed by a man whose mother died, broke and humiliated because of the woman sitting across from him, and who had spent 8 months building a paper trail good enough to bury her. Rosalind's first instinct was panic, and her second instinct, being who she was a plan. She'd talk her way out. She'd threatened clients before with vague warnings about spiritual consequences for those who doubted her, usually enough to scare off a skeptic. She figured she could scare off Nathaniel too, or at worst, pack a bag and be 3 towns over before he did anything with a homemade notebook full of handwritten notes that any lawyer would call flimsy. That's where she was wrong, because the notebook was never the actual weapon. It was the decoy. While Rosalind was rattled over a notebook, Nathaniel had spent those same 6 weeks doing something far more dangerous with far less drama. Every one of those different bank checks hadn't just paid Rosalind. They'd been structured, deliberately, in amounts and patterns that mimicked classic money laundering behavior, and every single one had been deposited into an account that used Rosalind's actual business license number, because Early, her own assistant, had handed it over weeks earlier. Nathaniel hadn't leaked information by accident. He'd recruited early on purpose, not with money, but with guilt. By showing him what happened to Vivian and asking Early to look at himself in the mirror and decide which side of that he wanted to be on. So by the time Rosalind found that notebook, she wasn't looking at a grieving son's diary. She was looking at the tip of an iceberg that state investigators had already been quietly examining for 2 weeks, flagged by a bank compliance officer who noticed a small-town psychic suddenly moving numbers that looked less like candle money and more like a laundering operation. Nathaniel hadn't just built a case against her for fraud. He'd built one that made it look, on paper, like Rosalind herself had been running structured deposits through a network of shell payments. The exact crime she'd never actually committed, dressed in evidence real enough to hold up in court, because every check, every bank, every amount had been his choice, not hers. He never had to prove she killed his mother. Grief isn't a crime. He just had to prove she was a fraud and let the money trail do something far uglier to her reputation than the truth ever could. Rosalind tried to run anyway. She got as far as the county line before 2 state vehicles pulled her over on a road she'd driven 100 times, lights spinning red and blue against purple curtains she'd never see again. Fenimore, a town of maybe 2,000 people, found out within a day that Madame Rosalind wasn't a third-generation clairvoyant. She was Dot Kessler, 41 years old, facing fraud and money laundering charges that could put her away for over a decade. And here's the twist under the twist, the part most people miss because they assume the story ends with handcuffs. Nathaniel didn't disappear once the arrest happened. He showed up one more time, at the now empty Sacred Circle, while investigators were still cataloging evidence. He walked past the purple curtains, set something on the reading table, and left without a word. $2,200 in cash, the exact amount of his very first payment, down to the dollar. Not revenge, not a taunt, exactly. A closing of the ledger on his terms, the same way she'd once dressed up a fake debt release as something sacred, except this debt was real, and this time, somebody actually paid it in full. The money the state eventually recovered from Rosalind's accounts didn't go back to Nathaniel. He didn't want it. He asked, instead, that it seed a small fund for families who'd lost savings to psychics and grief scams across the county, filed quietly under his mother's name. Madame Rosalind had never met a mark she couldn't read. Turns out the one time it mattered most, she wasn't reading a client at all. She was being read.